History often hinges on the decisions and lifespans of its key figures, and few loom larger than Alexander the Great. A military prodigy and charismatic leader, Alexander carved one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen, stretching from the Balkan Peninsula to the fringes of India. By the time he was 32, he had never known defeat in battle, but his sudden death in Babylon left the world wondering, what if he had lived longer? The conqueror, who refused to stop. Alexander's meteoric rise from the king of a small Macedonian kingdom to the ruler of most of the known world remains unmatched. His unmatched record in warfare wasn't due to luck. It was a mix of innovative military tactics, ruthless ambition, and an ability to inspire loyalty among his troops. That loyalty, however, began to waver. After years of relentless campaigns through deserts, mountains, and foreign lands, Alexander's army began to fracture. The dream of endless conquest began to feel more like a nightmare. Exhausted and far from home, his men longed for rest. After mourning the death of his closest friend, Hephaestion, and returning to Babylon, the heart of his empire, Alexander died mysteriously. Some say malaria, others whisper of poison or chronic illness. But in an alternate reality, let's imagine he survived. March to Arabia. If Alexander had lived on, he likely would have pursued a relatively modest campaign to conquer the Arabian Peninsula, or at least its coastline. This endeavor would serve both as a morale booster and a strategic stepping stone. Arabia was wealthy, connected to key trade routes, and ripe for the taking. With a successful invasion there, Alexander could regroup, rest his troops, and perhaps reignite their thirst for adventure, convincing the generals. But ambition alone wasn't enough. By this point, Alexander's generals were ready to retire. They had fought countless battles, accumulated immense wealth, and wanted to return home to enjoy the spoils of war. Conquering Persia was the ultimate goal for many of them, and they had already achieved it. Alexander, increasingly erratic and enamored with Persian customs, began alienating his once loyal officers. He demanded to be worshipped as a living god, a title his Macedonian men found abhorrent. Still, if time passed and new threats emerged, Alexander may have persuaded his generals to continue. Macedonia, despite ruling vast territories, still bordered tribal lands in the Balkans. Illyrians and Thracians posed a continuous threat, and Alexander could frame their conquest as defensive, turning his military machine toward Europe, into the Balkans and beyond. Had Alexander's army marched north and west, they would have faced a wild and fragmented Europe. Tribes such as the Illyrians, Celts, and Gauls controlled the mountainous Balkans and the plains beyond. But Alexander had conquered worse. His army had experience navigating hostile terrain from the Hindu Kush to the Zagros Mountains. Interestingly, we don't need to imagine how a Macedonian phalanx would fare against Celtic tribes. We already know. In our timeline, after Alexander's death, Celtic invasions into Greek lands were repelled within a few years. Given that, it's likely Alexander would have steamrolled tribal resistance and advanced steadily toward Western Europe. The fall of early Italy. One fascinating turn of this alternate timeline is what happens to Italy. In Alexander's time, Rome was still a small city-state, and Latin was a regional dialect spoken only in Latium. Southern Italy was heavily influenced by the Greeks, with many established colonies like Tarentum and Neapolis. An invasion of Italy by Alexander would not have faced a united Roman resistance. In fact, Rome might have been assimilated without much fanfare. Over time, the unique blend of Italic cultures could have been absorbed into Alexander's Greek-Persian imperial vision. Latin, without Rome's expansion and eventual dominance, might have disappeared entirely. The Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, would never have existed. A Hellenic version of Western Europe would emerge instead. Carthage and the Western Mediterranean. Once Italy fell under Macedonian control, Carthage would be next. This Phoenician city-state, situated in modern Tunisia, was a powerful maritime empire. But unlike Italy's tribal patchwork, Carthage was a unified and advanced civilization. It might have resisted, but likely not for long. Alexander was known not just for brute force, but also for psychological warfare and rapid sieges. If conquered, Carthage wouldn't necessarily be destroyed like it was by Rome. Its culture, language, and trade networks might have continued under Macedonian oversight. linked by road and sea to Alexandria, the jewel of Egypt, a multicultural empire encompassing Greece, Persia, Arabia, Egypt, Italy, and Carthage, would stretch from the Nile to the Atlantic Ocean. The real consequences. Despite this grand territorial fantasy, Alexander's extended life wouldn't be significant merely for the borders he redrew. His true long-term impact would be ideological. In our timeline, his early death led to his empire fragmenting among generals who eventually abandoned his vision of unity. Had he lived longer, perhaps 10 or 20 more years, he could have established a dynasty, central institutions, and an enduring cultural framework. He deeply believed in merging Greek and Persian customs into a unified empire, even insisting his officers intermarry with Persian nobility. His obsession with divinity, claiming descent from Zeus and styling himself after Persian god-kings, was ridiculed by his men, but may have laid the groundwork for a new imperial theology: religion without Rome. One of the most profound changes in this alternate world is the absence of Rome, and thus the absence of Roman Christianity. Without Rome's vast administrative structure, Christianity might never have spread across Europe in the way it did. No Roman persecution, no Constantine, no Vatican. Instead, the religious identity of the Western world could have been tied to a cult of Alexander himself. Like the deified emperors of Japan or the mythical emperor of mankind from science fiction, Alexander might have been elevated to semi-divine status, with his descendants claiming divine right to rule. Monarchs throughout the empire could trace legitimacy through a sacred bloodline, rather than Roman law or papal endorsement. This would reshape the spiritual landscape of Europe, replacing monotheistic Abrahamic faiths with syncretic, polytheistic cults. Western Europe might have followed pantheons mixing Greek, Persian, and even Celtic gods, preserved and altered over centuries. Language and writing. With Latin erased from history, the Greek alphabet would likely dominate the Western writing system, much like how the Slavs adopted and modified Greek to create Cyrillic, Celtic, and Illyrian tribes might have done the same, producing entirely new alphabets influenced by Greek structure but infused with local flair. These scripts, shaped by multicultural interaction, would leave us with alternate forms of literacy, art, and philosophy. The Renaissance, if it ever occurred, would be built on Alexandrian ideals rather than Roman revivalism. The realistic outcome. As enticing as this alternate timeline may be, the more realistic scenario is far less dramatic. Alexander's army was fracturing. His mental state was deteriorating. His insistence on Persian customs alienated his own Macedonian officers. Even if he had survived, the chances of another massive campaign were slim. He might have successfully conquered parts of Arabia before retiring to Macedonia. There, he could have spent his final years managing a fragile empire, pushing a cultural fusion of East and West that his successors would likely abandon. In fact, that's exactly what happened. His generals divided his empire and murdered his heirs, effectively erasing his family line. A legacy reimagined. Still, the potential of what could have been remains a tantalizing what if. A longer-lived Alexander might have shaped a unified Mediterranean world. Hellenic rather than Roman, polytheistic rather than Christian, written in Greek rather than Latin. It's a reminder that history is not inevitable. Sometimes, the fate of an entire civilization hinges on the life of one man, and what could have been if he had lived just a little longer. And that wraps up our journey through an alternate timeline where Alexander the Great lived just a little bit longer and reshaped the entire course of Western civilization. If you enjoyed this dive into alternate history and want to see more content like this, make sure to hit that like and subscribe.